Thank you, and thank you, Nicholas, for helping to set this up, and thank you all for being here. It is, in fact, Valentine's Day, so thank you for spending it with us here tonight. Turns out with the Olympics, love is almost always in the air. It was recently reported that at the London 2012 Olympics, organizers supplied athletes with 150,000 free condoms. This year and by the way, they ran out in London. According to Hope Solo, who was the goalkeeper for the U.S. Olympic team, she said she couldn't barely walk a few feet in the Olympic Village without tripping over people having sex in the grass. Then now in Sochi, 100,000 free condoms given out by this group, Love Condoms, part of the International Olympic Committee's efforts to combat HIV and AIDS. Love will make you do strange things, and I can tell you as a youngster, 19, I was representing the U.S. Olympic team in France wearing that stylish sweatshirt from the early 90s and standing, oddly enough, in front of a car. Even gets weirder. Standing with French policemen with a sweet mullet, I might add. So love will make you do strange things. In his detective fiction thriller, An Olympic Death, Manuel Vázquez Montalbán described what it was like to be in Barcelona as the city prepared to host the 1992 Summer Olympics. The acclaimed Spanish writer and novelist and leftist columnist for El País wrote, quote, "In this city, you were either working for the Olympics or you were dreading them. There was no middle ground." The idea that you're either for the Olympics or against them is common when the games roll to town, as you well know here in Vancouver. Supporters of the Olympics sing full-throated music about the sporting brilliance that will soon grace the athletic terrain. Boosters also promise those economic benefits for the city and its inhabitants, jobs, jobs, jobs. Elected officials, business leaders, and sports fans harmonize their messages, pledging there'll be this big influx of jobs, an uptick in urban development, and a spike in good cheer. As the games approach, the mass media cover the Olympic buzz. Meanwhile, some people question those happy-faced promises of Olympics boosters. Will the games really create a booming economy? And if so, for whom will it boom? Will hosting the games dissuade the tourism that might otherwise occur? Are the long-term jobs and investment promises just political windbaggery? And why are all those police and security officials requesting extra weaponry? Astride that, many people don't really care much about sports in the first place and don't much care that the Olympics are coming to their town and see sports as a sort of new wave opiate of the masses. Now, although Montalbán asserts that there's no middle ground, I think in Vancouver you know that things are actually a little bit trickier. You can be a sports fan who can appreciate the athletics out there that people have dedicated their lives to, while at the same time absolutely critiquing the grizzled underbelly of the Olympics, and there's lots of good reasons to do so, as we'll talk about tonight. I got my own experience with the U.S. Olympic soccer team at the age of 19. That's in France at a tournament. My first match that I played for an international match was against Brazil, and they had the likes of Cafu and Marcelinho, brilliant soccer players. Everybody in the arena wanted us to lose, and we obliged them by losing 2-0. I think pretty respectable, 2-0. Went on to play against what was then Yugoslavia, what was then Czechoslovakia, and finally played against the Soviet Union. Everywhere we went in France, we were booed. And as this naive young man going over abroad, my first time out of the United States, I didn't really understand what was going on. And so getting this sort of cold French shoulder made me go home and think about things and think about them hard and start to look into the history of the United States, the geopolitics and the role that it plays in foreign policy, and how this can play out in terms of the sports world. Fast forward 20 years, my experiences with soccer had pushed me to learn about this history, and I continue to appreciate the prowess of Olympic athletes. I'm watching and cheering on my favorite athletes out there in this Olympics. But I don't think that we have to sacrifice our critical thinking on the altar of sport. So what I'd like to do tonight is to present you with my idea of celebration capitalism, the affable cousin to Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism. I'll argue that celebration capitalism can help us reorganize our thinking on the modern Olympics, and I think it best captures the political and economic dynamics at work at the heart of the Games. I'll pay special attention a little bit to Vancouver, but most of you were here for that. Instead, I'll focus mostly on London 2012, where I spent the Summer Olympics, and I'll also talk about the ongoing Olympics right now in Sochi. Today, the Olympic Games are an enormous sports media and marketing event. It's a festival of top-tier athletics swaddled in both corporate cash and popular approval. When NBC played the 2012 London Olympics, it became the most watched event in the history of U.S. television. The BBC covered the Games, and 90% of the population in the UK chimed in to see what was going on. Yet the Olympics have not always been the jaunty colossus they are today. When the Games were revived in the 1890s, they looked quite a bit different. The modern incarnation of the Games from back then are the brainchild of French aristocrat Baron Pierre de Coubertin. Coubertin was an eccentric Anglophile who believed that blending rigorous discipline with manly self-display would reinvigorate the French nation after the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War. The Baron's Olympic idealism was rooted in a sort of quirky militarism. In an oft-quoted passage, he proclaimed, quote, "I shall burnish a flabby and cramped youth, its body and its character by sport." The Baron here won the prize for literature at the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm. Back then, they actually gave out prizes for literature and art at the Olympics, and he wrote under a pseudonym, but there's a lot of speculation that the judges knew it was actually the Baron because he had written previously a novella under the same pseudonym. But his poem called Ode to Sport won him the prize in poetry at those 1912 Games. In that poem, Ode to Sport, you get a pretty good look at what he thinks sport can be. He says it can be beauty. He says it can be audacity. He says it can be progress. You can be justice. It can be beauty, honor, pretty much you name it. And the Baron thought sport could do just about anything. Now, the Baron was a man of many talents, but penning feminist theory was not among them. He thought that women should basically attend the Games to put the laurels and the wreaths on the men's head when they won the prize. He didn't like the idea of women participating in athletics. He said that the best thing they could do was raise sons who could then participate in the Olympic Games. Not only that, but he baked in class privilege into the International Olympic Committee from the beginning. When he assembled the International Olympic Committee, he got together a bunch of his barons, counts, dukes, and princes, and formed this unit, the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC. And from the beginning, the Olympics were an elite affair. In fact, the very definition of amateurism that they picked up in the beginning was pure grade class privilege. People who performed manual labor for pay, say if you were a grape picker or a bricklayer. Even if it had nothing to do with sport, if you were performing manual labor for pay, you were considered a professional and thus you were not eligible for the Olympic Games. Now, eventually they changed that rule, and then years later they broadened the inner circle of the International Olympic Committee to include wealthy business people, and in 1981, they decided that it was okay to let women into the club. Yes, 1981. Can't blame them for blazing a trail. Today, the International Olympic Committee has that aristocratic flavor preserved in it. There's a member who's a princess from Liechtenstein, and there is also a prince from Saudi Arabia in the ranks. So what I'm going to do here is kind of trace out some of the key moments in the development of what I will eventually explain to you as my idea of celebration capitalism. And in a way, it started with the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles in ways that aren't necessarily immediately obvious. These games pivoted the Olympics sharply toward the political economic, and not just because they occurred during the beginnings of the Great Depression. In 1927, the California legislature passed the California 10th Olympic Bond Act, which was ratified by a 1 million person vote majority, and it supplied $1 million in bonds to fund the games. Shortly after that, the U.S. hit by this economic tsunami known as the Great Depression, and people started to protest. Literally, they went to Sacramento, signs in hand. They hit the streets with signs that read things like, "Groceries, not games. Olympics are outrageous." Meanwhile, of course, Olympic boosters said, everything's going to be awesome. This is going to produce the jobs that we need. The New York Times said at the time that the public is thoroughly fed up on these experiments in political economy. What they meant by these experiments in political economy was using public funds to pay for this big old sports festival known as the Olympics. Yet it's just this idea, this experiment in political economy, that starts to get traction even in the early 30s and has become the dominant mode of organizing the Olympics today. Other important changes from the 1930s include that for the first time, Olympic organizers in Los Angeles, they made an Olympic village where all the athletes stay during the games. They also limited the number of competition days, power packing it down into about 2.5 weeks, which has remained the same till today. And they also started to coddle the media a little bit. They brought them in, they treated them like royalty, and guess what? The media wrote positive stories about the Olympics. Lesson learned for the IOC, another thing that has remained all the way through to today. Being here in Canada, I probably don't have to say too much about the Montreal 1976 Olympics because they were a total mess. In 1970, Mayor Jean Drapeau infamously said the Montreal Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby. He actually estimated that the Olympics would cost $125 million. The cost ballooned to $1.5 billion, wasn't paid off for 30 years until 2006. And to top it off, a man had a baby. My home state of Oregon, Thomas Beatty, 2008, July, 2 years after the Montreal had paid off its debt, transsexual man right here, Thomas Beatty, had a healthy baby girl. So basically, Drapeau was wrong across the board. Another really interesting thing that happened in 1976, the 70s period, was that the International Olympic Committee had awarded the 1976 Winter Olympics to Denver, Colorado. Denver, Colorado citizens said, whoa, hey, wait a second, we don't necessarily want to pay for this thing, and we're very concerned about the environmental degradation that might occur. And they passed a referendum saying they weren't going to fund it, forcing the International Olympic Committee to move it to Innsbruck, Austria, the only time that's ever happened in the history of the Olympics. What that did was it set the table for this gentleman, Juan Antonio Samaranch, the unrepentant phalangist from Barcelona, big Franco fan, who became the head of the International Olympic Committee. And he decided that the IOC would need to diversify its revenue streams and make itself more appealing to potential host cities. The 1984 Los Angeles Olympics are sort of famous for being privatized, more than any other Olympic Games. But the background is that in the wake of the double debacle of 1976 with Denver and with Montreal, nobody wanted to host the Olympics. Kind of hard to fathom today because there are still host cities involved. Nobody was interested. Los Angeles was the only city that put forth a bid in 1984. So when they got the deal, they had incredible leverage over the International Olympic Committee to do things their way and that a city has never had since then. And so I think we need to kind of keep that in mind. Los Angeles is sort of pointed to as the neoliberal Olympics, and in part because they started, the International Olympic Committee around this time started to really cozy up to corporate sponsors and to bring them in. Just in the wake of the Los Angeles Olympics, they started something that was originally called the Olympic Partners Program, eventually became known as the Worldwide Partners Program. That's what it's called today. And basically this is all these corporate sponsors who we've come to understand that support the Olympics. This is from the London 2012 photograph taken by the photojournalist Martin Slavin, and it captures a lot of the corporate sponsors. Now, what happens, though, is we look at these corporate sponsors and we think, oh, there's been this sort of privatization of the Olympics. But what I'm going to actually argue today is that the Olympics themselves are not fundamentally a neoliberal affair. To be sure, the modern games emanate neoliberal capitalism in several ways. They've become much more commercialized as private capital has taken on a bigger role with corporate sponsorship. Also, private security firms have in some instances taken on a bigger role, as they did in London 2012. More on that later, in terms of policing the games and that. Yet the public routinely pays for a large majority of Olympic costs rather than privatizing these costs. And corporate sponsors hold privileged position for future PACs. The free market does not decide, if you will. Rather than deregulation, with the Olympic machine, we see a stringent regime of rules and regulations emanating from the IOC. Rather than economic financialization, where fictitious funds are ferreted away in abstract configurations, we get public debt, strict payment schedules, and all. In fact, what I'll argue tonight is that the Olympics are a prime example, though certainly not the only example, of celebration capitalism, a specific formation of capitalism that in many ways slices against the neoliberal zeitgeist. But to understand celebration capitalism, we first need to consider Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism. And in her excellent book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, Klein explains how capitalists capitalize off catastrophe, swooping in to exploit social trauma. When a disaster happens, like a war, hurricane, military coup, terrorist violence, or a severe economic downturn, we see collective states of shock that can often soften us up to the point where we're willing to give up things that we would never give up during normal political times. Klein talks about how what happens in the wake of a disaster is we get neoliberal policies rooted in privatization, rooted in deregulation, and rooted in free market rhetoric about letting the market decide. Now, she does write that oftentimes this privatization, or sometimes, can be paid for with public money. Her primary contention is that the ultimate goal of the corporations at the center of disaster capitalism is to essentially normalize the privatization of the public sphere. So with celebration capitalism and disaster capitalism, both of them happen in states of exception, where we're willing to give up things that we wouldn't otherwise give up, where plucky politicos team up with their corporate collaborators to push through all sorts of things they always dreamed of but never could get through. Now, as you can see there, you got with Klein's disaster capitalism, it's peril, and you get neoliberalism. The celebratory state of exception is exuberance. It's celebratory. And instead of getting neoliberal capitalism rooted in those principles, what you get instead are public-private partnerships. These public-private partnerships are, in fact, lopsided in favor of the private entities that do not put in as much in terms of input or in terms of risk. The point, I suppose, is that capitalism is a nimble shapeshifter, and it shows flexibility. It can take different forms in different moments. In fact, it can take different forms in the same historical moment. I'll argue disaster capitalism and celebration capitalism can sort of team up as this devastating, merciless 1-2 punch. Disaster capitalism and its austerity measures can lead us toward this relief of celebration capitalism that then in turn means we have no money left, so we need to impose austerity again. So it's this sort of 1-2, they fit together. Furthermore, it helps explain a trend that David Harvey highlights, that capitalism never solves its crisis problems, it moves them around geographically. So if you look at the proliferation of sports mega events, you see them happening in Beijing, Summer Olympics 2008, South Africa, World Cup 2010, and then you've got Sochi right now, Winter Olympics. Russia also will host the 2018 Soccer World Cup. And then, of course, Brazil is getting hit with the double whammy this summer, the World Cup, followed 2 years later, 2016 Rio Olympics. These mega events help sop up surplus capital through spatial displacement. While disaster capitalism rules on entities like the World Trade Organization, World Bank, and IMF, of course, celebration capitalism, when it's in the form of the Olympics, has its buddy, the International Olympic Committee, to look out for it. So I'm going to quickly run through what I see as the central tenets of celebration capitalism. And as I say, it all starts with that state of celebratory exception. The mass media play a linchpin role in proliferating happy-faced messages about what's going on. In the lead-up to the Olympics, we see a little bit of critical space. You certainly saw that in Vancouver. But once it all starts, the press, as they said about the people in Vancouver, they start to look at the people who continue to question as whiners and grumble bunnies. That's straight out of the Canadian papers there. So they have a role, the mass media, in fomenting the political spectacle. A third dimension is this notion of festive commercialism. When I was in Brighton, right before the 2012 Summer Olympics in London, I went down and watched the torch relay, which is one good example of this festive commercialism. It rolled through Brighton. First, you saw these huge corporate buses, Coca-Cola, TSB Lloyd, you name it. And then you see eventually the single guy with his Olympic torch. But that was an incredible picture. The people to the side of him there are actually police, or rather security officials, and you can get a better look at them from behind there. There was police vehicles all around because they didn't want the celebration to be stopped. Now, of course, they can't totally stop it. As you well know, there's a lot of things when the Olympics roll into town that there is to critique, and so you always are going to see activism cropping up in the face of this behemoth that rolls through town. Fourth, and this is really the vital epicenter, the sort of political economic heart of celebration capitalism, is this notion of the public-private partnership. In fact, Amjo Hall, who was just up here a second ago, he kind of gave me the slogan when I introduced him in the lead-up to the Olympics. He gave me the slogan for celebration capitalism when he said, "The Olympics are a corporate franchise that you buy with public money." To be sure, we're all fed a stream of steady promises that the Olympics are going to bring a boom time economically, but if you look at the work of independent academic economists, you will not find that to be the case. These economists have found that the Olympics generate what they call a tourism displacement effect and something they call the stay-away factor. So tourists that would normally visit the city, say London 2012, lots of people go to London in the summer. Those people stay away because prices they go up during the Olympics, and the Olympic tourists maybe come in, but it's just a shift. There's no uptick in the amount of income that can form a multiplier effect in the economy. They also talk about, the independent economists, this notion of a substitution effect. As you know, when the Olympics come to town, everybody's income doesn't just magically rise or something. You pretty much, if you have a salary, fortunate enough to have a salary, it pretty much stays the same. So when the Olympics come to town, you might come and spend your money there, but you don't spend it in your local community where you would have spent it at the coffee shop or the tavern or what have you. Another element to these public-private partnerships is that when it comes to the pinch, the public is always going to be the fiscal backstop because they do not want to look stupid on the international stage. And so if private entities flop on their backs and say, hey, sorry, we can't help anymore, we were out of money, we're bankrupt, or we just don't want to continue, you can bet that the host city government is going to figure out a way to make it happen. And the last element is this idea of cost lowballing, where they say it's going to cost this much during the bid process, and then it costs this much later, exponentially higher, of course. There's also the tenet of environmental and social sustainability. We all feel good when we hear about how sustainable the Olympics are going to be and how green they're going to be and all that kind of stuff. But unfortunately, the Olympics does not have a very good track record when it comes to creating real deal sustainability. Of course, it's difficult to do when you have all these people flying into the Olympic city. Missions are going to go up, and then you're hosting the people in the village. But it turns out that a lot of what is done in the name of sustainability is actually quite hollow, and I'm going to follow that up later with some examples from London and from Sochi. But the point, I guess, in Under Celebration Capitalism is that each Olympic city obligatorily has to claim that they are the greenest games to date. It's just what you got to say, and everybody says it. Of course, there's critics who say that's a whole lot about greenwashing. This came about in the 1990s when the IOC brought sustainability into its discourse, making it the third pillar of Olympism. Finally, if there's anyone who benefits a lot from the Olympics, it's the security industry and often local policing units. The Olympics are the biggest peacetime operation that many host cities will ever experience. And so the role of security is to try to deflect negative attention in ways that will distract us from the sport spectacle. Local police officials and the security industry more generally essentially treat the Olympics like their own private ATM, bolstering and militarizing their weapon stocks. It's celebratory militarism, if you will. That teal color you know so well here. As if that weren't enough, a lot of times Olympic security officials will essentially conflate activists or people who raise questions with terrorists. A good example is Chris Allison, who was the national coordinator of the Olympic security. And when he appeared in front of the London Assembly in 2011 in advance of the London Olympics, he was asked, what are the 4 key risks to the Games? And he said they were terrorism, protest, organized crime, and natural disasters. Now you can imagine how London-based activists felt about getting sandwiched between terrorism and organized crime. Now, celebration capitalism exhibits these 6 central features, but it takes distinctive form depending on the political and historical context. These elements combine to forge a celebratory space where political activists and social critics are unwelcome. So let's take a look at a few specific recent examples. Right here in Vancouver, you've got this piece that Gord Hill allowed me to use that it really captures nicely a lot of the critiques that emerged out of Vancouver during the Olympic moment, from the militarism to the marginalization of local populations to the corporate bigwigs walking out with the money. The Olympic price tag in the bid book to Vancouver was $1 billion, but by the time it was all over, it's more in the neighborhood of, now most people are saying, about $8 billion. Vancouver journalist Bob Mackin got it right when he wrote, quote, British Columbians learned that the bid book was like an Etch-a-Sketch pad. So it goes with celebration capitalism. Then there's the Olympic Village, as you well know. When the private developers went belly up and failed to get the job done, the public was forced to step in and pay. The promises about social housing down the tube in the name of letting the market decide, if you will. Then you got the militarization of Vancouver. It was striking when I came up here during the Olympic moment to sort of see it come into the city from the fighter jets to the medium-range acoustic device that was purchased, although disabled essentially because of the hard work of activists and the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, which basically in the end, the Vancouver Integrated Security Unit decided to disable the weapons function, essentially making their MRAD, this military-grade weapon used in Iraq and other war zones, making the MRAD a sort of glorified bullhorn. You've got, during the state of exception, all these laws that need to be harmonized to make them into accord with the International Olympic Committee's Olympic Charter. In fact, when potential host cities right before the final vote, they sign a contract that says we will make our laws fit with the dictates of the IOC. That means sometimes changing the very laws of the city or the laws of the country. And so you saw this sort of famous incident where the sign bylaw was in the middle of this imbroglio over this art over on East Cordova Street. Eventually, as the police officials backpedaled and said, oh, it's not about this special ordinance for the Olympics, about a graffiti bylaw. But meanwhile, when I took these photos when I was up here once, and the media were on this. This was a Northern European film crew that was very interested in this. And as I say, celebration capitalism is such a massive juggernaut that when it rolls into your town, it inevitably steps on the toes of extant movements that are already hard at work, that in some cases come together to work together in that Olympic moment. London 2012, we see a whole lot more celebration capitalism at work. The estimated cost at the beginning of the London Games was $3.8 billion. However, once they got the Games, it skyrocketed to the average estimate that most people say of $15 billion. So from $3.8 to $15 billion. One credible estimate from an activist named Julian Chain, he said it was $21 billion. A Sky Sports investigation actually costed it out at $38 billion when you put all the infrastructure costs into it. And interesting enough, the organizers of the Olympics are really happy to claim all these projects as Olympic legacies, but they don't like to list them on the tally of costs when they're saying how much the games are going to cost. Kind of interesting dynamic we've seen across various sites. So a huge amount of money spent on the London Olympics. This despite the fact that a report that was issued well before the London Games by an actual agency of the government in the UK said that, quote, the hosting sports mega events, quote, appear to be more about celebration than economic returns. I mean, their own government documents very clearly laid this out. That didn't stop people like Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, who promised that the London Olympics were going to be, quote, a gigantic schmoozathon. The question again, for whom does this thing boom? And it really was laid out clearly by Moody's Investor Services that after, right at the beginning of the London Olympics, said who was going to benefit from the schmoozathon, and it was what they called corporates, because there's all that corporate hobnobbing that goes on. At the same time that he was talking about the schmoozathon, we had the Prime Minister, David Cameron, pulling a number magically out of his hat that says that London was going to benefit with £13 billion worth of investment. And people were like, where'd you get that number? Oh, don't worry about that. £13 billion. So you see these huge promises appearing. And if you questioned them and said, okay, do you mind showing us the numbers? You were seen as the Grumble Bunny from Vancouver. The public pays, private bails theme crystallized in the construction of the Olympic Village, where athletes were housed during the London Games. The Olympic Village was supposed to be financed by a private developer, but the 2008 economic collapse and the attendant credit crunch led private capital to abandon the project and leaving the British government in the lurch. They said that they needed to fully nationalize it, which is to say have the British taxpayers pay for it. There was a taxpayer loss when they sold the Olympic Village to the ruling Qatari family's realty firm. They lost £275 million on it, and they just kind of said, oh, see, that was a great deal for everybody, wasn't it? As they throw all that taxpayer money down the tubes. When you attended the London Olympics, which I did, you could be forgiven for thinking you dropped in on a military hardware convention. There was surface-to-air missiles ratcheted to the roofs of apartment buildings. This is one of those apartment building complexes. And you know how they found out that they were going to have surface-to-air Starstreak and Rapier missiles ratcheted to their rooftops? They came home one night and found a little flyer slipped under their door which said, guess what? We're going to put missiles on your roofs. And the people freaked out and thought, are we going to become a target now of terrorism? Whereas before we were just a nice tall building. So you've got these surface-to-air missiles. You've got police in all these places guarding the Olympic clock. I mean, shoot. Even the mascots of the Olympics, Wenlock and Mandeville, look like two-legged surveillance cameras. You also have the state of exception where they set up these special driving lanes. In London, there was 250 miles of these driving lanes that were reserved for athletes and medics. Hey, that makes perfect sense. They got to get to their events on time. IOC officials and also corporate sponsors. Those people only were allowed in these 250 miles of Olympic lanes. This actually set up a huge imbroglio with cab drivers who were very upset about it, and they engaged in some creative action I could talk about later, some interesting union activism. So the Olympics in London also at the same time pointed to this sort of monomaniacal brand management that was going on. There was a cafe in Plymouth that they were trying to get in the Olympic spirit, and they put on their menu this thing called the Flaming Torch Breakfast Baguette, thinking they were getting in the Olympic spirit. IOC, well, actually the ODA, the Olympic Delivery Authority, a public body, cracked down on them and said, you got to take that off your menu. This is an infringement of trademark protection. There was the Knitters, who decided that this Ravelry group was going to have the Ravelympics that included such events as scarf hockey and the sweater triathlon. Well, they got a letter from the United States Olympic Committee telling them, it was a cease and desist order that said that their efforts denigrated the true nature of the Olympic Games and that they needed to stop because they were infringing trademark protection. It was interesting, actually, the Crochet Liberation Front emerged out of that and just hammered the USOC, and the United States Olympic Committee eventually had to backpedal. Speaking of backpedaling, the corporate sponsors were the real leverage point of fight back in London. There you can see the worldwide Olympic sponsors there, many of them known for their corporate misdeeds. And the Olympics provide this opportunity for what sports journalist Dave Zirin calls corporate sin washing, whereby you use the Olympic Games to cozy up to consumers so they'll forgive you your trespasses. In fact, corporate sponsorship of the Olympics may even encourage the worst of the worst, some scholars have suggested, by saying, hey, you can drop down $10 million on an art center, for example, and look good. Or you can drop down $100 million on the Olympics and look good. In the 2012 Olympics, they started something called the Sustainability Partnership. And you think of BP when you think of sustainability, right? I know I do. There's also EDF Energy, which pushes nuclear power, General Electric. These are not exactly the firms you think of when you think of environmental stewardship. In fact, a Toronto media firm recently released what they saw as the top 100 corporations when it came to responsibility for the last year. Among that top 100, how many corporate sustainability partners were on them? One of them on the list, and it was Cisco. All the rest, nowhere to be found. Now, this ended up being a real source of fight back for activists in London. You can see them fighting back against McDonald's. There was this really smart greenwash gold campaign that challenged BP, Rio Tinto, and Dow, three notorious companies for their environmental misdeeds. They created these online videos, which you can still see if you go to greenwashgold.org, and you could vote for them. And who was going to win the prize for greenwashing? They had this big ceremony out on Trafalgar Square, and they threw green custard to represent the greenwashing that was happening on the tops of the heads of the winners. Police actually swooped in and arrested these activists for littering the public square, and they were given bail conditions that prohibited them from attending future protests. So we're seeing that happen, sort of preemptive arrest. Guess what? Right before they were to face actual charges, everything was dropped, and they said, forget it. And so that by then they had been essentially demobilized from engaging in solidarity work with other people in the Olympic cause. Then we've got Sochi, where we see celebration capitalism with distinctly Russian characteristics. Now, a lot of people focus on the fact that Vladimir Putin played a big role in securing the Olympics, and that's true, because the Olympics are a quirky process where if your leader of your country shows up and makes big promises, they tend to just believe you across the board. There's been a lot of attention recently given to the anti-LGBTQ legislation, the anti-gay propaganda law, if you will, in Russia that was signed into law last summer by Vladimir Putin. There's been protests around the world about that. I always found it kind of interesting that when they released the official gloves, I mean, it looks like almost propaganda that could get you arrested. Those are the official Sochi gloves right there. In any case, Putin got his buddies to really kick in to a certain degree, and I'll get in more detail in a second, his buddies being the oligarchs who made off like bandits during the oligarchic bacchanalia, also known as the Yeltsin years. Essentially, they had made all these billions, and along comes Putin and says, if you give me some millions, I'll let you keep your billions, and you give your millions to the Olympic cause, and you won't become the next Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the head of Yukos, who was put in prison for a decade or so on dodgy charges. Finger snap let out right before the Olympics, you may recall as well. Putin snapped his fingers in his finger snap authoritarianism, and bam, Khodorkovsky comes out of jail. The Pussy Riot, 2 people from Pussy Riot get early amnesty, and so on. But these Olympic Games have been the most expensive in the history of the Olympics, $51 billion and counting. All the Winter Olympics stacked up on top of each other does not equal the price of the Olympics in Russia. You've got the oligarchs lining up. That's Vladimir Potanin on the right, standing with Dmitry Medvedev. And he kicked in a couple billion to build the Rosa Couture ski slope. Now, what's tricky about this is you might start to think, hey, wait a second, private entities are actually kicking in? Sort of. Because a lot of the oligarchs are running state-run corporations. So when the oligarchs are kicking in, they're kicking in state funds, essentially. And the state banks are backing this as well. One recent study carried out by Alexei Navalny, the anti-corruption activist in Russia, said that about 4% of the overall costs of the Sochi Games, 4% are truly private costs. 96% are public monies. So again, fitting with that theme of the corporate franchise bought with public money. In Sochi, you see Dow becoming an official carbon partner of the game, tasked with minimizing Sochi's 2014 carbon footprint. Coca-Cola is seen as a sustainability partner as well. They put out these fancy documents about how, and they give out these special sustainability awards. Coca-Cola won one of these. It's like they're just congratulating each other and handing out awards to each other in advance of the games and drumming up that sustainability spirit. You've seen, some say, as many as 70,000 members of Russian security forces that have blanketed the area around Sochi. And then you also saw a whole slate of legislation. I mean, the anti-LGBT law has gotten a lot of attention, but there have been a number of repressive laws that have been put into place quietly in the years in advance of the Olympics. Take one where if you're an NGO who receives money from an outside group, you have to register with the government as a, quote, foreign agent, which echoes back to Soviet times and not in a positive way. There's a whole host of other laws that are so capacious as to be able to fold in almost any form of speaking out publicly about issues around the Olympics in a critical fashion. Putin announced a couple months before the Olympics that there would be no protests, zero, zip, goose egg, no marches, no pickets, nothing between January 7th and March 21st. He just decreed it, creating basically a 1-month buffer on either side. He got some pushback and eventually said that there could be protest zones, very much like the ones incidentally set up in Beijing. Unfortunately, these protest zones are 7.5 miles from the nearest Olympic site. You have to register for them, which has led many people to say they're more activist snares than they are spaces for vibrant dissent. You also have, on top of this, the fact that Sochi is sitting in the middle of a geopolitical tinderbox. Just to the northwest of the disputed zone in pink stripes there of Abkhazia, been in dispute with Georgia and Russia for a long time. 25 kilometers from Abkhazia sits Sochi, very close to Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, where anti-Russian sentiment roils. In fact, less than a year before the Olympics started, this self-appointed emirate of the Chechnya and the North Caucasus, Doku Umarov, said that he and his fellow militants would, quote, do their utmost to derail the Olympics, which he saw as, quote, satanic dances on the bones of our ancestors. And he promised that there'd be payback during the Olympics. And not unlike Goldcorp's decision to build a mine in Guatemala atop previously communal indigenous Mayan lands, the Olympics are happening on the site of the Circassian people's devastation, that what scholars of the period call a genocide, where in the 1860s, Tsar Nicholas II brutally repressed the Circassian people. Sochi is actually a Circassian word, sent them into diaspora, many of them living in Syria, Turkey, where there have been anti-Sochi protests recently, Lebanon, there's a big pocket of them in New Jersey in the United States. You can see some of them. I took these photos in London. They showed up in London. They were here in Vancouver during the Vancouver Games and protesting building the Olympics on top of the graves of their ancestors. Now, during the Olympic torch relay designed to drum up this festive feeling of joy, the Olympic torch in Sochi went out more than 40 times, just poof, the wind blew or what have you. And also actually set 3 people on fire throughout the course of the torch as well, kind of scary. But and this is a classic moment where it goes out and some dude standing there like pulls out his lighter and lights it, which is major no-no in Olympic land. You're supposed to have the sacred flame. They got 2 of them always around, and you light it with the sacred Olympic flame. You don't just get out your Zippo and light up the torch again. But, you know, in a way, it sort of shows, I think it's symbolic of how in Sochi anything is possible. And even with the monomaniacally micromanaged spectacle of the Olympics, there's still room for the unscripted, for the unpredictable. And we saw this recently, early on, in the snowboarding competition. This was an incredibly, I think, courageous and amazing thing that this young man, Alexei Sobolov, the Russian Olympic snowboarder, did. After his run, he got off his snowboard, popped it off, laid down and point to the balaclava wielding person who is also, you can't see it that good in that picture, but she has a knife, an unmistakable allusion to the band Pussy Riot. There's also the Cheryl Maas, the Dutch skier, who came down at the end of her ski run and thrust her rainbow glove, replete with sweet unicorn, in front of the camera. And the IOC themselves have given more space than usual for expressing political dissent. Now, they absolutely would oppose this sort of thing, making a political statement in the competition space or on the medal stand. They say, no, you shouldn't do that. But actually, Thomas Bach, the new president of the International Olympic Committee, just before the Games said it'd be okay if athletes wanted to speak out about equality in press conferences. So I think we're going to probably see more of that as the Games go by, because the big thing that the International Olympic Committee can do to athletes who fight back or question is kick them out of the Olympic Village. And toward the end of the Olympics, they're not going to much care if they get kicked out of the Olympic Village, the oversized rabbit hutch that it may be. The other thing that happened recently was a little fight over the Canadian freestyle skier Sarah Burke, who was a real trailblazer in getting some of these sports onto the Olympic agenda. She helped establish halfpipe skiing as a discipline, and it's making its debut in Sochi. So a number of athletes, including the Australian snowboarder, very outspoken Australian snowboarder Tora Bright, have said they wanted to put this sticker on their helmet that just acknowledges her trailblazing ways. But the International Olympic Committee said, no, we're trying to manage our brand and you can't do that, which has really upset some snowboarders, and so we'll see what happens with them. So, you know, as we nestle in to watch the Olympics, the Sochi Olympics, let's just absolutely remember that brute economics reign behind the scenes and that we could do a whole lot better with this Olympic spectacle. And I've got a lot of ideas for maybe how we could improve the Olympics, from democratizing some of the sports to revamping the way that the contracts are set up in the first place so more of the money can stay with the people who actually build the venues in the host city. The people most affected by the games actually get something out of the deal at the end. I would be a big fan of bringing back the tug of war. That was actually a big sport in the early 1900s because anybody almost, you need a rope and some people that can hold onto it and pull it, whereas like equestrian or dressage, horse ballet, I mean, it's expensive to keep one of those horses and maintain it and train it, upwards of $70,000 a year. Not everybody can do that. Almost anybody, any country could get their rope out and get a tug of war team going. So there's all sorts of things you could do to make the Olympics better. With a jolt of creativity and vision, the Olympics could be and should be much more democratic and egalitarian. So with that, thank you very much, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jules. We can go right out to questions and comments from people. So.
I can think of all kinds of reasons why we should boycott the Olympics. I'm surprised that you're not calling for that based on environmental, human rights, political, economic, nationalistic fervor. In Russia, there's probably 12 different issues that people could raise about why they'd want to boycott it based on that alone. So just your thoughts on that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for raising that question. I do not support an athlete boycott of the Olympics. Basically, what we do when a government decides to boycott and not let their athletes go, the athletes are the ones who pay the price. And I can't think of a good example during the boycott period of the 1976 through 84. I can't think of a great example, especially the USSR boycott back and forth. I can't think of anything that really happened of value for real people on the ground based on those boycotts. So I don't support an athlete boycott. Second, I think that if you recall from 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, that iconic moment when John Carlos and Tommy Smith thrust their black gloved hands into the Mexico City sky, there was actually a big boycott movement among athletes. Some of the biggest names in sports were seriously considering not going to the Olympics because of a whole range of reasons, a lot of them having to do with things going on in the United States. And yet Carlos and Smith went, and they were in that sort of milieu that was thinking about a boycott. Had they boycotted, we would have never had that moment that is not just a moment of sports history, but it's a moment of world history. And so we would have deprived ourselves of that. Think about it. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the basketball player, Lou Alcindor at the time, he actually did decide to not go to the Olympics, just said it wasn't worth the trouble. We don't talk about Lou Alcindor because of the Olympics, right? We talk about him because he was a great basketball player and all that, but he missed that chance. Now, where I do support a boycott would be with people who are traveling to the Olympics, the sort of Olympic mavens who are going to bring their tourist dollars to Russia and reward that system. That, I can get behind that kind of boycott, and I support that. And I think that if you are one of those people that loves the Olympics, you should think twice about going there and handing over your hard currency to that particular government. But yeah, it's a really good, tough, complicated issue.
My question is, with so many obvious failures in many cities over time, what is the incentive for cities to get behind the Olympics now, and what explains the enthusiasm?
Well, I would say that with a lot of countries, it's a chance, and you hear this sort of narrative when they're talking about it. For a lot of countries, it's about showing the world that we can do this. You certainly saw that in Russia. You saw that with the World Cup in South Africa. And you've seen that in the lead up as people bid on these games. You can show the rest of the world that you can come through with a big, shiny moment of Olympism. In terms of the enthusiasm, there's a lot to be gained for private companies. And think who's pushing the bids in a lot of these cities. I mean, think about Jack Poole in Vancouver. Think about the economic bigwigs that went to the schmoozathon, the gigantic schmoozathon with Boris Johnson. They actually do gain from the Olympic machine. And so if you look at who's driving the bid, is it from a bottom-up, grassroots, we want the Olympics in our town kind of thing? No, it's these corporate honchos who see it as a chance to milk the Olympic cash cow with both hands. And so a lot of times what's construed as support for the Olympics is a mixture of elites demanding it and a lack of a critical media narrative that allows critical voices in to challenge it. And plus, as I say, the Olympics in general are super popular. I mean, I'm in a very small minority in my family. When I want to talk about the Olympics, people don't think about it in a critical way. So, in the bigger picture, it's just popular. It's immensely popular. It's like better than free beer in the United States or cute kittens. It gets better approval ratings almost. It's huge. So there's that side of it too. And there's not that many cities going for the next Olympics. Actually, Boston in the United States is putting forth a bid, it looks like, for the 2024 Summer Olympics. And I felt like one thing to me that was fascinating in that process, they asked Mitt Romney, former Republican candidate who ran against Obama last time around. He was the governor of Massachusetts, and he also swooped in the wake of the bribery scandal in Salt Lake City and worked with the very progressive mayor, Rocky Anderson, to try to salvage the Olympics there. They went to Romney and said, what do you think about Boston doing this bid, being the former governor? And he did some serious truth-telling. He actually said that it might be a lot of fun. We might have a lot of great athletes come to town. That'll be great. But the Olympics are not a money-making opportunity. That was Mitt Romney. And I thought, wow, the things are changing the way people are talking about it. Even Mitt Romney now is willing to say that. Despite the fact that Mitt Romney's horse, or him and his wife's horse, Ann Romney's horse, called Rafalka, was a star of the 2012 Summer Olympics. I don't know if you knew that. They had a horse in that dressage competition, horse ballet, basically. So he has a vested interest on numerous fronts. But even he said, this is not a money-making proposition for the general population of a city.
I'm wondering, in your travels and in your research, if there are examples of creative and intelligent and inspiring activism and protest that you could elaborate on.
Absolutely. Well, starting right here in Vancouver, I mean, in fact, many of the people in the room were involved in creative activist fight back that I really admire the efforts of many people right here. I mean, there was great stuff going on. You saw the Olympic Tent Village, a quick slide of that. You saw the actions at Vivo organized by Nicholas Perrin, Cecily Nicholson, and Amjo Hall, and others that brought together people to show video footage and have panels and have honest discussions. I mean, I won't talk about Vancouver because you're all here, but London was really exciting too. You saw the Custard Seven and their whole Greenwash Gold campaign. Youth Fight for Jobs did a really exciting alternative Olympics where they had a shot put a Tory competition, and you got on these teams and you actually engaged in athletic events, and they gave out medals and all that, and they had this gaggle, this one team of the sort of thuggish corporate guys, and they would give the political message. They'd sort of say something especially thuggish to represent the greed of the Olympics. But you got to participate. You were running around. You were having fun. You were talking politics. So there was that too. There was the group called the Space Hijackers in London, and they were hilarious because McDonald's is the big worldwide corporate sponsor of the Olympics. And so within Olympic venues, only McDonald's French fries can be sold, or chips, if you will, in the UK. And so the Space Hijackers created this huge catapult that they were going to catapult good chips over into the Olympic areas. And did they actually do it? No, because they probably would have gotten cracked down on. But they did create a space for conversation to talk about this incredible brand protection. And unbelievably, this online campaign, which I'm generally somewhat skeptical of, although I sign my name on them and stuff, petitions online, by this group called 38 Degrees, was incredibly effective, because one thing I didn't mention was that when the Olympics touch down, it's sort of like this tax-free zone for these corporations, and certainly for the International Olympic Committee, where they don't pay taxes to the city that they're visiting. And when this group got wind of it, they just thought it was ludicrous, given the huge price tag that taxpayers were funding. And so they started this online campaign and pressuring the Olympic sponsors, these worldwide partners I had up there, to give up their tax break. And so much pressure came around that finally Coca-Cola and McDonald's fell, and then one by one, these corporations gave up their tax-free status because of an online petition, getting a huge windfall for the taxpayers of the UK. So, I mean, like serious material reward for a pretty basic online petition. So, I mean, I think that creativity just flows out of the Olympic moment. And I would say athletes are also creative beings, and I'm hoping we're going to see some more creative activism before these Sochi Games are over as well.
Thanks, Jules. It was great to hear how your thoughts have developed on this over the years. I was thinking about the idea of the state of exception, and you talked about how in both disaster capitalism and celebration capitalism, it proceeds from a moment of a state of exception. And as I understand that concept, the state of exception is interesting because it starts off as an exception to the rule, but then it becomes the rule. Mm-hmm. And so that exception becomes the rule. Can you talk about how that has begun to happen? How that moment, rather than being an exceptional thing that passes when the games or whatever are over, mm-hmm. become the status quo? Yes,
and you essentially paraphrased Giorgio Agamben's version of the breaking of the norm becoming the norm. And I would say we've seen it in a number of different ways. For starters, just stepping back a little bit, seeing how the Olympics have become this huge, huge operation. And if I've looked through some of the letters that members of the International Olympic Committee frettingly wrote to themselves in the 1960s and 70s about this thing called gigantism, that they were really concerned. The Olympics are becoming too big. We need to scale it down. But obviously they have not done that. They've gone in the total opposite direction even after the Montreal debacle. So, the state of exception leads to that, and that's become the norm. The funding, where taxpayers fund a huge bit of the bill, has become the norm. People often point to Barcelona, 1992 Olympics, as this special Barcelona model. And I looked at the numbers from that. I was in Barcelona, and when you get inside some of the material, because there's this sort of happy sheen about Barcelona, like it was so great, it was the Barcelona model. But when you look at some of the materials that are written in Spanish and not translated to English, it's not such a happy face. And even that Barcelona model, it was 33% only was put in by private bodies into that Olympics. That was the highest I've ever seen in terms of private input into the Olympics. So the state of exception has become the norm with public funding for these Olympics. And then the incredible militarization of the public sphere. And of course, it's not just the Olympics. That's a general trend that's been happening. But with the Olympics, it just gets amplified and made so much worse. And it creates the new normal that there's military weapons. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the MRAD or the LRAD. The London Olympics had themselves a long-range acoustic device. It was like, my acoustic device is bigger than your acoustic device thing. But they basically look like little satellite dishes that you aim at people and crank up this lever, and it just sends ear-piercing sounds straight at the target, used in military situations. So allowing our police forces to use military-grade weapons, like that's crazy. And that's why I feel like we need to, and people did in Vancouver, speak out against that kind of thing, because if you don't, then it becomes the norm. It ossifies into normality. And so that's why when it comes to the Olympics, on many fronts, it's so important to protest early and protest often. In fact, the most effective Olympic protesting is maybe done before the games are actually awarded to your city. And we just saw that in Stockholm, where people said, no, we don't want the Olympics, and they couldn't get the public support. And you had the referendum here, but so there's a state of exception, Stockholm, that I wouldn't mind seeing more communities having the opportunity to decide. Now, if a community gets the information, a city gets the information, and they know this is the deal, and we're probably not going to make money a la Mitt Romney, and there's a majority that want to have the Olympics, far be it from me to tell a particular host city not to do it, but I would like to see a new normal where there's actually a legitimate opportunity for citizens of these potential host cities to register the reality of the Olympics before it's just foisted upon them.
Hi, Jules. Thanks for coming up again. Good to hear what you've done with this. Maybe two questions. One, just to hear a little bit about Brazil and I guess pushback that's being organized there. And I would guess, and I'm probably speculating here, but with it being in Rio, that for some reason there are higher stakes with the development around that because of the discrepancy in incomes, and I guess just the divide of the city, probably even more so than Sochi because it's a much smaller place. And then to ask a question also sort of around the idea of fast policy, and the idea of the Olympics is kind of a carrier that takes in, that brings with it solutions from one city to the other. And the idea being that you can have this one solution solves all problems sort of formation like the Olympics that you drop on different locations that have different tensions and social limitations and potentials that could come out of them, and how, if indeed it does actually function other than just militarily to kind of like bring about similar planning strategies to the cities that it hits.
All right, thank you. In terms of Brazil, I have not been to Brazil, though I know some people, at least one person in the room, just moved here from Brazil, so maybe would like to weigh in if they want to. But I haven't been there, but it's amazing what's happened in terms of the pushback in the streets. So Brazil's hosting the 2014 World Cup this summer, and what FIFA, the world governing body for soccer, does is they give you the tournament 1 year earlier, the Confederations Cup. And it's sort of a trial run in certain respects for doing the World Cup. And huge protests around the country from people from different backgrounds even protesting. And they found themselves a relatively open political opportunity structure in the sense that the president, Dilma Rousseff, was in certain respects amenable to some of the grievances of activists, and unlike other places where there would be no support brooked for protest movements, there was a little room at the top, if you will, to listen. And just incredible movement, activism, and I think it promises really well for the World Cup and for Rio. And I would just say that one thing I found really interesting about the fight back last summer was that it actually created this little pocket of space for members of Brazil's national soccer team to speak out. And so you had people like Neymar, one of the biggest names in world football, plays for Barcelona, standing in solidarity essentially with the protesters. You had a guy who plays for Brazil named Hulk, which I think is just awesome in the first place, named Hulk, a big man, plays forward. He spoke out in favor of the protesters' demands. You had Romario, the former high-scoring forward for the Brazilian national team, who's now an elected official in Brazil, who was saying incredible things about the games and the Olympics rolling in the World Cup and the Olympics rolling into town and just making off like bandits. So I think we have an interesting summer ahead of us in a lot of respects, and got to give it to the Brazilians for getting out in front of it and being able to hold that complexity in their minds. I mean, they showed us that we need not devote ourselves to the death of complexity. We can cheer for the Brazilian football team and fight against these incredible taxpayer odds that are put on us. So in terms of the moving of these plans from site to site, we are seeing more and more of that. There's been a lot of good work done by this guy in London named Mike Rako about these public-private partnerships and how he calls it the London model that has essentially been exported to Brazil. And a lot of the technocrats that worked in London with the London Organizing Committee are now going to Brazil. And you see this sort of peripatetic community of technocrats that have sort of fastened themselves parasite-like on the mega event train, and they kind of follow it around from place to place. And so I would say, yeah, we are seeing a little bit of knowledge transfer as maybe inside the IOC jargon might have it. But again, it's public-private partnerships paid for with public money. Some 43,000 public-private partnerships contracts in the London 2012 games, and that's the new normal going forward as well. And the other thing I would just say about that is that the public-private partnerships, it makes it sound like it's maybe a fair process where all private companies could come along and just say, I'd like to give that one a go. Absolutely not. They've become so technocratic, specific. You need a legion of lawyers on your side. So what these public-private partnership agreements have essentially done is winnowed out any kind of small business who could ever dream of applying for these things, and it just teed it up for these huge corporations that A, have experience with mega events, and B, have that legion of lawyers that they can put out at their disposal. So the public-private partnership scheme is rigged in favor of corporations in a pretty major way. And you're seeing that transfer from site to site. And it's not even that the companies that put forth the best bids, the lowest cost bids, are picked. A lot of times they're picked because they did one before. And so that's how you see this sort of fast-paced transfer happening as well. It's definitely, the market's not deciding. A lot of times it's cronies deciding who's going to get the next big contract. Build Heathrow? Well, you could probably build some of these sports venues. That's what happened in London. It wasn't the lowest cost, most efficient bid along the dictates of competitive neoliberal capitalism.
I was just going to share a couple of comments, Jules. Not so much a question, but based on your talk, particularly around public-private partnerships. When the games are awarded to a city like they were in Vancouver in 2003, the agreements that are signed between the government and IOC oftentimes don't come into public view. And here, the agreement, particularly around sponsorship, I think it eventually came public. And I think it might have been Bob Mackin's work that did that, or the BC Civil Liberties Association. When you read the fine print and the protection of the corporate sponsors that are put forward, like taking all of the billboards in the city, for example, are all given over as part of the sponsorship package. During one of the public talks that happened in November of 2009, prior to the actual Olympics, the head of intellectual property for the Olympics was on a panel, and one of the arguments that he made is that if we don't protect the private sponsors, there's more public money at risk. So there's a public interest to protecting so those are the kinds of things that when you have policies put forward like roving volunteer teams to check for ambush marketing and these types of terms that get thrown out, it gets beyond absurd. The other comment was just around the expansion of security, some of which would have happened anyway, but the acceleration that did happen here, prior to the awarding of the games, we didn't have armed transit security or even the Canadian Border Services Agency. Many of those things probably would have happened anyway, but it was done under an accelerated frame here. And thirdly was just in the preparation for the games, the level of absurdity of things you wouldn't even imagine that was going to happen when the provincial government brought in legislation to essentially move homeless people that were in the city. The naming of the act itself was called the Assistance to Shelter Act. Or even more absurd things that oftentimes are in the realms of military or security establishment ideas that usually don't hit full public. There's kind of a space that's created. So in 2008, for Beijing, the Chinese government actually engaged in attempts and trials at weather modification during the Olympics. So that sounds like quacky, crazy stuff, but it's a matter of public record that happened. So,
I thought that act was called the Olympic Kidnapping Act. I didn't know it's called the Assistance to Shelter Act.
We've got time for about 3 more questions.
Yeah, the U.S. Olympic Committee is behaving like it's owed the games for 2024, and you mentioned Boston is looking at a bid, and the bids won't be due till 2017. But do you think they'll actually have any success? Because in the post-2008 world, we're focusing more on public debt, and cities and states and provinces are now more better informed about the risks of holding the Olympics, especially after what happened here in Vancouver in 2010, right after the economic meltdown, after the promises that were made here that the sponsors, the broadcasters, the tickets would all pay for it, when the organizers actually lied to us the very week they told us that they were actually going back to the government from our subsidies. So, and we saw with the 2020 bids, Italy pulled out because of that, because it was worried about debt. And Spain didn't succeed because the IOC was smart enough to understand that that country couldn't afford it. Do you think that in this world, especially now with Sochi spending $51 billion, the Winter Games are supposed to be cheaper, but now they're not. Do you think that the U.S. actually has any success, that there will be actually any city or state that will actually truly embrace it, or do you think the IOC will have to change its model?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that right now there's a lot of cities that have voiced interest. The United States Olympic Committee sent out a letter to 35 potential cities, including where I live in Portland, saying, hey, if you're interested in the Olympics, you should start talking to us. You know, let us know if you're keen to the possibility. And a bunch of cities did respond: San Francisco, Philadelphia, Dallas, Boston, Los Angeles, and others. And so there's initial interest. And I think that there's 2 ways to answer your question about whether the U.S. has a chance. One is, can the populations get on board with the Olympics? And I think it's still possible to, maybe hoodwink's too strong a word, but maybe it's not. It's possible to hoodwink a population into the whole economic thing. Everyone's going to be great. But it's much harder, as you just indicated. I agree with you on that. The other part of assigning the Olympics is what the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is going to do. And the United States Olympic Committee has gotten on the bad side in certain ways of the IOC. And Obama making a big thing about not attending the games, and and also sending these people over in the official delegation, like Billie Jean King, although unfortunately she was unable to attend, Caitlin Cahow, the out lesbian hockey player, and then Brian Boitano, who came out of the closet after he was named to the delegation. That makes the IOC so mad that they are very less likely to do the United States any favor, even if the United States puts forth a reasonable candidate city. So there's the whole population side, but then there's the whole IOC hardball. We resent the USOC for a bunch of reasons. Now, the United States just got somebody put on the executive board of the IOC, so now we kind of have an insider that maybe will help with that, to assuage some of those negative feelings that the IOC might be having. But I would say overall, I think the chances are not great. The IOC recently said that the chances for the United States was pretty good for 2024, though you might want to focus on 2026. But I read that as just full-on hocus pocus, this just IOC speak. Yeah, you should give it a try. Yeah, sure. But I mean, even the bids cost in the millions of dollars now. Even the bids. And there has been a shift in how we've talked about it, because people from these cities are like, we're not paying for the bid if we can't even get the thing. And so you have seen private entities forking over the millions that it takes to put forth a bid. So if I was at Vegas right now and putting money down, I would say no, U.S. will not get the 2024 Olympics.
I have a question. From where I stand, I actually have a very negative view of the Olympics, totally. It is, to me, it is a sports cultural imperialism imposing by the West on the non-Western countries, the people of the world. But having said that, and your talk, you build your talk as celebrate capitalism. It is capitalism because it's turned into a commodity, and it's a very exclusive commodity only for the rich. And earlier you just said that even for the bidding for the site itself is cost in the millions. And so it is a very effective way of barring, screening those other people for even taking part in it. So it's strictly a game played according to the definition, according to the dictates of the West. My question to you is that, do you think that they're able to have an international sports event without the dominance and the dictates of the West? I'm thinking about that. It's almost like, the children's song, I know of an old lady who swallowed a fly. I don't know why, but she'll die. So the old lady swallowed a frog to swallow the fly. And then she has to swallow a bird to swallow the frog, to swallow the fly. The problem, of course, is the fly. And the problem is still, is the capitalism over there. Mm-hmm. Any kind of tinkering to change the appearance of that is, to me, is the suggestion that you're going to propose a better frog.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much. And I think there's a whole lot of truth to what you're saying about how sport can be a force of imperialism. Absolutely. And yeah, no disagreements there. And with you can see it actually in Sochi in the sense that the United States is racking up a bunch of medals on these sports that many of the countries of the rest of the world don't have yet. So they're ahead of the curve in imposing these new sports on places that are now sort of catching up a little bit and starting to win medals a little bit, but it's mostly US, Japan, and Canada who are benefiting, and Norway as well, but that's more the Nordic skiing. So in terms of can you really make a better Olympics, or are you just going to tinker around the edges? I agree. I think there needs to be a massive overhaul of the way the Olympics are organized economically. But I think it could happen. I don't see why. I mean, aside from the politics of getting some of these things through, which is huge, I don't see why, if we just set that aside for a second, we can't dream up a totally different way of doing it that captures the money locally, doesn't let it leak out to corporations, sets up fair living wage agreements for people who work at the games, makes sure that local people are hired for building the construction sites. There's lots of things that you could do to improve city infrastructure. And, like Athens, for example, even though it was a total debacle, they got a nice subway system out of the deal that people are still using today. They also got a bunch of stadiums that are being used. One of them is being squatted in right now. Well, I guess, and that one at least is being used for something positive, but the rest are just a sort of herd of angry white elephants. But I think you could seriously revamp the games in a way that could be very much aimed toward more social justice, and it wouldn't be that hard to dream it up. In fact, there's a group that has done that in Switzerland. We were talking about this earlier, that has dreamed up a possible map for how you could do things. And that would have to be adjusted for each community. So I'm not quite ready to throw out the whole game yet, because I think it could be a force for good, but right now it is a bit of a political economic mess.
Maybe in response to the last two questions too, and as a bit of a comment on everything that Jules is saying, I think one of the interesting things about the Olympics is something that we protest. It's kind of a cousin of other global gatherings like the WTO or the G20, but it's discursively, it includes people other than the oligarchs or the states. And so part of what the Olympic project is in response to Naomi Klein's idea of the shock doctrine, is it's what comes along later and helps communities imagine themselves be a part of the capitalist project that's going on. I mean, that's kind of what its idea is. That's what celebration capitalism is. It's a way to include people's idea of themselves in the project of development. And in the sense of, I guess what I was asking about Brazil and kind of thinking about the Olympics then as this site that we can imagine ourselves on the inside of or the outside of, the way in which we protest that and the way in which we change that is probably, I guess I was just going to say, I really appreciate the way it is that you're kind of like leaving it difficult, and that it is a site of leverage, and that the, I'm getting lost a little bit here, but the idea that people could somehow still be on the outside, on the inside or the outside of it, makes it vulnerable to pressure from the outside and from activists in a way that something like the G20 or the WTO isn't necessarily susceptible. And so that seems to be the point of leverage, hopefully, that we can look for in Brazil, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I like the way you put that. And with like when the huge global leaders meet from the WTO, they just put up that hard security wall and no one's coming in. And with the Olympics, they can't do that. You can't have the securitized spectacle that's too intense. You have to sort of hide it a little bit. And people can get in to certain degrees. Not everybody can get into the venues, of course. That costs money. But you can get into the conversation in ways that are much more difficult with some of these other venues.
Just last to respond to that, too. I think that it's interesting, or not interesting, the way in which the Olympics doesn't have to be what it says it is. It can just be what it is now and continue to roll after Russia. It seems to be a step forward in the some sort of opening of the discourse, actually. Rather connecting it with Putin and that type of a project, rather than being a step backwards, the brazenness of what it is that's happening there seems to be a success, I think, for Olympics protest, rather than the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
We've got time for one more question if anyone has anything or a comment. Right. Just wanted to thank Jules very much, and thank you very much for being here this evening.